The clay tablet sits in the British Museum, and the catalogue number, BM 78943. It weighs less than 2 pounds. Its surface carries wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus pressed into soft clay over 3,700 years ago. The text preserved there describes something that should not exist in ancient literature. A detailed account of divine beings organizing a labor strike, complete with procedural documentation of who stopped working, when they stopped, how they organized their protest, and what the ruling gods decided to do about it. The tablet is part of the Atrasis epic, and the passage in question is not vague. It does not speak in metaphors about cosmic principles or seasonal cycles. It describes gods, specifically the Egi, a class of younger deities who dug canals and cleared rivers for 40 years before laying down their tools, surrounding the house of the chief god Enlil, and burning their work implements in protest. The text records their complaints, the assembly convened in response, and the solution agreed upon: the creation of human beings to assume the labor. The gods refused to continue. If you're listening to this late at night, or perhaps during a quiet afternoon somewhere far from where these tablets were found, leave a comment about where in the world you're hearing this story. There's something worth considering in how words pressed into clay in ancient Mesopotamia can travel across millennia to reach you now. This account appears across multiple manuscript traditions. The Old Babylonian version dates to approximately 1700 BCE. Neo-Syrian copies from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh carry the same narrative 1,000 years later. Sumerian precursors contain related material. The story did not change in its fundamentals across this span of time. Whatever this text preserves, the scribes who copied it, generation after generation, believed it important enough to transmit with remarkable consistency. The revolt is not a peripheral detail in Mesopotamian tradition. It is the central event that explains why human beings exist. In the Sumerian worldview, humanity was not created as the crown of creation or the beloved of the gods. Humanity was created as a labor solution to a divine management problem. The gods created us according to these tablets because other gods refused to work. What follows in this account is an examination of what the tablets actually say happened during that revolt. The specific claims they make, the details they preserve, the procedures they describe. This is not an attempt to prove or disprove the account. It is an investigation into what the ancient Mesopotamians themselves claimed occurred, why they documented it in such procedural detail, and what patterns emerge when you examine the revolt, not as mythology but as a text that presents itself as record. The tablet sits in its climate-controlled case. The cuneiform is clear. The translation is verified. The question it raises remains open. The architecture of divine labor. Before the revolt could happen, there had to be work. The Atrazi epic does not begin with the rebellion. It begins with a description of the labor itself, what the gods were doing, where they were doing it, and for how long they had been doing it. The text in the translation by W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard, published by Oxford's Clarendon Press in 1969, opens with a temporal marker that establishes when these events occurred, when the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads. This is presented not as mythological time, but as a specific period, a time before humans existed when divine beings performed physical labor. The work is described in engineering terms. The gods dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they cleared watercourses, they excavated canals, they carried baskets of earth. The Akkadian terminology used apu for basket, haranu for excavation work, naru for river comes from the technical vocabulary of actual Mesopotamian engineering projects. These are not poetic flourishes, they are the terms a scribe would use to describe real construction work. The text specifies which gods did this work. The Igigi. This term appears consistently throughout Mesopotamian literature to designate a class of younger gods distinct from the Anunnaki. In the cosmology preserved in these texts, the Anunnaki are presented as the senior gods, the great gods, the decision-makers. The Igigi are the lesser gods, the ones assigned to labor, the workforce. The duration of this work is given with precision. Tablet I of Atrahasis states that the gods dug the watercourse, and that for 40 years they bore the toil. Some versions say for 3,600 years, using the Sumerian jar, a numerical unit that could mean either 3,600 or be understood as a long but definite period. The variation matters less than the fact that a duration is specified at all. The text treats this as measurable time, not eternal mythological past. The Enki and Ninmah myth preserved on tablet 13877 in the Nipper collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum provides additional detail about the nature of this work. It describes the gods carrying the pickaxe and the basket, the standard tools of Mesopotamian excavation crews. The text states, "They made the Tigris and Euphrates flow through their labor, not through divine decree or cosmic word, but through physical work with tools." There is a pattern here worth noting. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, including K549, c. The creation of humanity is explained differently. In that text, humans are created after the defeat of the goddess Tiamat, fashioned from the blood of her consort, Kingu, and assigned to serve the gods so that the gods may rest. But even there, the underlying assumption is identical. Gods were laboring, gods needed rest, humans were created to replace divine labor. The Sumerian flood story, also called the Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablets CBS 10673 and CBS 10867 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, contains fragments that reference the creation of humanity in similar terms. Though the tablet is damaged, the readable portions speak of kingship being lowered from heaven, of cities being founded, of humans being placed in those cities to do work. The text associates with earlier divine activity. Mainstream scholarship interprets these accounts as etiological myths, stories invented to explain why human beings must labor. The reasoning goes that ancient peoples faced with the harsh reality of agricultural toil and hydraulic engineering in the challenging environment of Mesopotamia created myths that justified their suffering by projecting it onto a divine prehistory. In this reading, the gods represent natural forces or social classes, and the myths encode cultural memory of early civilization building efforts. This interpretation is supported by the fact that similar creation myths appear across many ancient cultures, usually explaining human existence in terms of service to gods. The myths serve social function, reinforcing hierarchical structures by presenting labor as divinely ordained. The procedural details can be understood as the projection of familiar Mesopotamian labor practices onto imagined divine prehistory. The gods work like Sumerian corv crews because that's the model the mythmakers knew. But there are details in these texts that sit uncomfortably with pure invention. The emphasis on duration, the repeated insistence that this labor lasted for a specific measurable period, is unusual for mythology meant to justify eternal conditions. If the purpose is to explain why humans must always labor, why specify that gods labored for only 40 years, or for a countable number of char periods before refusing? The distinction between Anunnaki and Agi is maintained with remarkable consistency across different texts and time periods. If these are simply metaphors for social classes or natural forces, the metaphor is oddly specific and stable. The Agigi are always the laborers, the Anunnaki are always the rulers. The relationship between them follows defined hierarchical patterns that recur in text after text. The technical vocabulary is precise. The texts use actual terminology from Mesopotamian engineering and administration. They describe recognizable tools, measurable units, specific locations. The Tigris and Euphrates are real rivers that required extensive hydraulic management throughout Mesopotamian history. The work described excavating channels, clearing watercourses, maintaining irrigation systems, matches the kind of labor that Mesopotamian cities actually organized and documented in administrative texts. Consider what the text is claiming, that the river systems of Mesopotamia were excavated by divine workers before humans existed. This is presented not as metaphor but as sequence. First there were no rivers, then divine workers dug them. Then those divine workers stopped. Then humans were created to continue the work. The claim is coherent, sequential, procedural. It's also utterly incompatible with geology. The Tigris and Euphrates are natural rivers formed over millions of years by tectonic and erosional processes. They were not dug, but the text presents their excavation as engineering project, with workers, duration and management structure. Either the text is complete fabrication, or it preserves a radically different understanding of how the landscape came to be. One that prioritizes construction over formation, intelligent design over geological process. The texts themselves offer no indication that they consider this metaphorical. They present the divine labor as fact, as history, as something that happened in the same matter-of-fact tone used elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature to describe the reigns of kings or the construction of temples. The stylistic markers of parable or obvious fiction are absent. The genre signals history, not fable. What emerges from examining just the description of the labor, before we even reach the revolt itself, is a coherent account of a work project. Who did it? What they did? With what tools? For how long? In what location? The level of procedural specificity suggests a text trying to document something, not a text inventing something. Whether what it documents actually happened is a different question, but the text behaves as if it believes what it's recording. 40 years of digging. The revolt did not erupt spontaneously. The Atrasis epic describes a progression. First complaints, then collective organization, then confrontation. The sequence suggests planning, coordination among the Igi, and a shared sense of grievance that built over time until it reached a breaking point. The tablets published by Andrew George and Farooq Alawi in Iraq Volume 58. 1996 designated tablets from the Sippar Library. 6 contain some of the clearest preserved passages describing the onset of the revolt. These tablets, excavated from the ancient city of Sippar and now split between the Iraq Museum and the British Museum, preserve a version of Atreus that includes details not found in all manuscripts. According to the composite text reconstructed from these sources, the EG began to complain to each other about the burden of their work. The text states they spoke one to another, suggesting conversations among the laborers rather than formal complaints directed upward to the Anunnaki. The language implies organization at the peer level, a spreading dissatisfaction that moved through the workforce before becoming overt action. The specific trigger for the revolt is described clearly. The text says the IG counted the years of dredging. They measured the duration of their labor and found it excessive. This is not inarticulate rage, it is calculated assessment. They performed an accounting of how long they had worked, and concluded the burden had become unbearable. The act of counting suggests record-keeping, collective memory, awareness of time's passage. The decision to revolt appears to have been collective. The Atreus tablets do not identify a single leader among the AG who organized the rebellion. Instead, the text indicates the gods held a meeting among themselves and filled the night with their outcry. The language describes a deliberative assembly of the laborers, not a spontaneous riot. They gathered, they spoke, they decided on action together. The form the revolt took is described with remarkable specificity. The AG did not simply stop working. They engaged in what can only be described as organized protest. According to Tablet 1 of Atrahasis, they set fire to their tools. They took their spades and their baskets, the implements they had used for 40 years, and burned them. Then they proceeded in a body to the residence of Enlil, the chief god, the one who had organized and overseen their labor. The text preserves their approach. In the night, in the middle watch, they surrounded the house. But the god Enlil did not know. The temporal marker, the middle watch of the night, indicates a coordinated time for action. The fact that Enlil did not know suggests the revolt was kept secret until the moment of confrontation. The Agigi planned their action, chose their time, moved together, and achieved surprise. What happened next follows a procedural sequence that reads, like administrative response to crisis. Enlil's vizier, Nusu, awakens him and reports that the house is surrounded. The text records dialogue. Nusu tells Enlil, "My lord, your house is surrounded. A rabble has gathered at your door." The term used gabahu, meaning assembly or crowd, can carry both neutral and negative connotations, and here clearly indicates the ruling god's perspective that this is an improper gathering, a breach of order. Enlil's initial response is to retreat. He tells Nusu to bolt the door. Then he convenes a council, sending word to the other great gods, Anu, the sky god, and Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, to come to his house while it is under siege. This detail is peculiar. The chief god, surrounded by his own rebellious workforce, does not immediately assert authority or call for suppression. He secures his position and seeks counsel. The council scene is preserved in multiple manuscript versions. Anu arrives. Enki arrives. They ask Enlil what is happening. He describes a situation. The EGI have surrounded his house. They have stopped work. They are demanding something be done about their burden. The text records that Enlil then poses the question, Anu, will you take authority in heaven? Will Enki take the command? He is asking who will handle this crisis. What follows is a negotiation, not a battle. Nusu is sent out as envoy to address the assembled. He asks them to identify their grievance and their leader. The text preserves his question. Who is the one who started the war? Who is the one who began the battle? The terminology is revealing. Kablu battle and Tamharu fight. Military language applied to a labor dispute. From the perspective of the ruling gods, the work stoppage is warfare. The EG respond collectively. They answer, every one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. There is no single leader identified. The rebellion is presented as unanimous decision. The phrase, every one of us Kulatuna, emphasizes their unity. They frame their action as Tahazi warfare, but their complaint is about Dulu work and Ubalum burden. They are fighting, they say, against the work itself. This response is reported back to the Divine Council. The text then describes Enlil's reaction. He weeps tablet. I states that Enlil's tears flowed. Before he speaks, before he decides on action, he cries. It is a humanizing detail. A god moved to emotion by the rebellion of his workforce. Whether this emotion is grief, frustration, or recognition of genuine suffering is not specified, but the tear flows before the solution is proposed. It is Enki who suggests the solution. Create a substitute worker. The text records his speech to the assembled council. While the birth goddess is present, let her create a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the burden of the gods. The term translated as primitive worker is Lu, which can mean human mankind, or specifically a laborer. Enki proposes manufacturing a new type of being, specifically to do the work. The Uijigi refuse. The proposal is accepted by the council. No god objects. No one suggests punishing the Uijigi or forcing them back to work. Instead, the divine assembly agrees to create humanity. The birth goddess named Ninu, or Bel-Ilai or Mami, depending on the manuscript, is summoned. She is told to perform the creation and she agrees. This sequence, revolt, council, decision to create humans, is the core narrative structure of Atrahasis. It appears in every version of the text from Old Babylonian manuscripts, dated to 1700 BCE, through Neo-Assyrian copies, made 1,000 years later. The basic plot does not change. The Iji stop working. The Anunnaki convene. Humans are created as replacement labor. Academic interpretation sees this as origin myth structured around Mesopotamian political realities. The Divine Council mirrors Mesopotamian civic assemblies. The labor dispute reflects real tensions between ruling classes and corv workers in ancient Mesopotamian cities. The creation of humans as replacement laborers justifies the social order. Just as the Ig served the Anunnaki, so humans serve the gods. And by extension humans serve human rulers, who represent divine authority. This reading is supported by the structure of Mesopotamian society, which extensively used forced labor for state projects, temples and palaces, conscripted workers for building, excavation and agricultural work. A myth that frames humanity's purpose as divinely mandated labor serves to naturalize and legitimize these practices. It transforms social oppression into cosmic necessity. But there are elements that resist this neat explanation. Why present the revolt as successful? If the purpose is to justify human subservience to authority, why show gods successfully overthrowing their working conditions? The Igi are not punished for their rebellion. They are accommodated. They get what they demanded, relief from labor. The Divine Council does not suppress the revolt. It solves the problem the rebels identified. This is not a myth that teaches submission. It is a myth that shows successful resistance forcing systemic change. The EGI organize. They act collectively. They confront power, and power blinks first. The solution involves creating a new underclass rather than disciplining the rebels. But the rebels themselves achieve their goal. They never return to the work they refused. From a social control perspective, this is a peculiar narrative to preserve. If the intention is to justify corv labor, why show that refusal to work can succeed? Why demonstrate that collective action by laborers can force even the highest authority to seek alternatives? The other peculiarity is the procedural precision. The text records not just that a revolt happened, but how it was organized, what time of night it occurred, how the ruling gods responded step by step, who spoke, what was said, how the decision was reached. This level of detail is characteristic of historical chronicle, not of mythological archetype. Mesopotamian myths usually operate with broader strokes. They describe cosmic battles between order and chaos, seasonal cycles of death and rebirth, relationships between cities and patron deities. The level of procedural minutiae in the Atrahasis revolt sequence, middle watch of the night, door bolted, envoy sent, question posed, collective response given, tears shed, proposal made, goddess summoned, reads more like administrative documentation than like cosmic parable. The text knows the details because it is documenting an event it considers historical, or it has elaborated procedural details to make an invented event seem historical. Either interpretation acknowledges the text is doing something unusual. It is presenting material that demands to be understood as record, whether that record is accurate or fabricated. The revolt happened. The council met. The decision was made. That is what the tablets claim, and they claim it with the confidence of texts that believe they are preserving true history. The council that changed everything. The divine assembly in response to the Ig revolt reveals something fundamental about how these texts understand governance among the gods. The decision to create humanity is not made by decree of a single supreme deity. It emerges from a council, a deliberative body where multiple voices speak and consensus must be reached. This pattern appears consistently throughout Mesopotamian literature. The Anunnaki function as a collective governing body. Major decisions, who will rule the cosmos, how to respond to human overpopulation, whether to send the flood, are made in assembly. Individual gods have authority within their domains, but shifts in cosmic order require broader agreement. The structure mirrors Mesopotamian political organization. Sumerian cities had assemblies of elders alongside kings. Major decisions, particularly those involving warfare or allocation of resources, required deliberation among multiple stakeholders. The divine council in myths reflects this earthly structure. Or alternatively, Earthly assemblies model themselves on perceived divine precedent. When Enlil finds his house surrounded by the rebelling Ejigi, he immediately convenes the council. He sends for Anu, his father, who holds authority in heaven. He sends for Enki, his brother, the god of wisdom, and the subterranean sweet waters. These three, Enlil, Anu, Enki, form the core leadership of the Anunnaki in most Mesopotamian texts. They are the great gods, the decision-makers, the ones whose agreements shape reality. The location of the council is significant. It meets at Enlil's house, which is under siege. The rebels have not dispersed. They remain present as the deliberation occurs. The council is convened under duress, with the Igi literally surrounding the venue where their fate is being decided. This is negotiation under pressure, not calm philosophical deliberation about the nature of humanity. The procedure follows defined steps. First, information gathering. What exactly is happening? Enlil explains the situation. Second, authority clarification. Who has jurisdiction? Enlil asks Anu and Enki whether they will take command. Third, investigation. Nusu is sent to question the rebels directly. Fourth, reporting. Nusu returns with the Igi's response. Fifth, emotional response, and Lai weeps. Sixth, proposal. Enki suggests the creation solution. Seventh, implementation. The birth goddess is summoned and given instructions. This is bureaucratic process. Each step follows logically from the previous. There is no moment of divine omniscience where the gods simply know the solution. They must investigate, deliberate, propose, decide. The text presents gods who operate within procedural constraints, who must gather information and build consensus before acting. The figure of Nusu deserves attention. He appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as Enlil's minister or vizier, the one who communicates Enlil's commands and reports back to him. In the Atrace Revolt, Nusu functions as mediator between the ruling gods and the rebels. He is the one who goes out to the assembled Ijigi, asks their grievance, receives their response, and conveys it back to the council. This mediator role is essential to the structure of the narrative. The Anunnaki and the do not speak directly to each other. Communication is channeled through an intermediary who translates between levels of the hierarchy. Nusu represents bureaucratic apparatus, the administrative layer that manages communication between those who command and those who labor. When Nusu addresses the Gigi, he asks them to identify their leader. The text preserves his question. Who is instigator of war? Who is instigator of hostilities? He is seeking someone to hold responsible, someone with whom the council can negotiate, or against whom they can act. The question assumes hierarchy. Even among rebels, there should be someone in charge. The Agi's response refuses this framework. They answer collectively. Every one of us gods has declared war. There is no single instigator to identify, no leader to isolate. The rebellion is unanimous, leaderless, or more precisely collectively led. Every participant is equally responsible. This makes negotiation more difficult. There is no representative to summon, no single deity whose concerns can be addressed to end the crisis. This collective stance is tactically sophisticated. By refusing to identify leaders, the Agi protect themselves from targeted retaliation. The Anunnaki cannot arrest or punish a few ringleaders to break the rebellion. They must deal with the entire workforce as a unified body. The leverage remains with the rebels, as long as they maintain solidarity. The content of the Agi's grievance, as reported by Nusu, is specific. The load is excessive, it is killing us, our work is heavy, the distress is much, the language is physical. Hubbalum load, Dalum labor, Captum heavy, Marushu illness, hardship. These are not abstract complaints about dignity or recognition. They are concrete objections to the weight and duration of the work itself. It is after hearing this report that Enlil weeps. The text is clear. The tears come after the complaint is articulated, not before. Enlil hears that the work is killing his workforce, and he cries. The response suggests he did not know the God who organized the labor system did not realize, or had not acknowledged that it was unsustainable. The revolt forces recognition of what had been ignored or denied. Then Enki speaks. His solution is pragmatic. Create a replacement. Let the birth goddess create a luller. Let him bear the yoke. Let him bear the burden of the gods. Let him carry the toil of the gods. The repetition of let him bear and let him carry emphasizes the transfer of burden. The new being will do what the Igi refused to do. The problem is not eliminated, it is outsourced. Enki's proposal contains a curious phrase, primitive worker or mankind. The term Lulu can mean both. It can designate humanity as a category, or it can mean a laborer, specifically someone engaged in rough physical work. In either sense, the being to be created is defined by function. The first question about humanity in this narrative is not what is a human, but what will a human do? The answer, the work, the gods refuse. The council accepts this proposal without recorded dissent. The text moves immediately from Enki's suggestion to the summoning of the birth goddess. There is no debate, no alternative proposals, no objection that creating a new class of beings to exploit might be ethically problematic. The solution is obvious to everyone present. Manufacture workers. The birth goddess is addressed by multiple names in different manuscript versions. Ninu, Bel, Ili, Momi, Ninma. All these names designate the same role, the goddess responsible for birth, for formation of life, for the crafting of bodies. She is the specialist, whose expertise is required. The council knows what needs to be done, but only she knows how to do it. Enki addresses her. You are the birth goddess, creatress of mankind. Create Lulu. Let him bear the yoke. He then adds a significant detail. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man carry the load of the gods. The work is specifically identified as belonging to Enlil. It was his project, his responsibility, his failure that led to the revolt. The solution transfers Enlil's burden to the new beings about to be created. The goddess responds, but she sets a condition. Different manuscripts preserve her speech with slight variations, but the core requirement remains constant across versions. I cannot do it alone. Enki must be present. He must purify the materials. Only then can I work. She requires assistance from the god of wisdom, birth goddess and wisdom. God must collaborate. Creation is too complex for a single deity. This collaborative requirement structures what happens next. The actual creation ritual, the specific procedure by which humans come into being, requires both Enki's knowledge and the birth goddess's skill. Neither is sufficient to load. The text is setting up a process, not a miracle, and the process will require materials, rituals, and very specific ingredients that take the narrative into territory that becomes increasingly difficult to read as simple metaphor. The council has decided, the specialists are engaged, the procedure is about to begin, and the tablets preserve that procedure in detail that demands attention. Blood and clay. The creation of humanity in Atrasis is not described as cosmic word made flesh. It is presented as a manufacturing process with specific ingredients, defined steps, and multiple iterations before achieving successful results. The level of procedural detail suggests either a text documenting an actual ritual or a text imagining creation in terms so concrete they resist purely symbolic reading. The ritual begins with material selection. The goddess requires two primary components, clay and divine blood. The clay is straightforward. Tissue, the Akkadian word for mud or clay, the material from which bricks were formed, vessels were shaped, and according to Mesopotamian understanding, bodies could be crafted. Clay was living material in Mesopotamian thought, drawn from the earth, moldable, capable of taking and holding form. The blood is more complicated. The tablets state that a god must be slaughtered to provide the necessary divine essence. The text does not suggest volunteers. Instead, the council identifies a specific deity to be killed for this purpose. Different manuscript versions give different names. Some call him We, others Gestui. Some use a generic term meaning simply a god. But all versions agree a deity will die to provide the material for human creation. The selection process is described in the Sipar Library tablets published by Andrew George and Farouk al-Rawi. The text indicates that the council calls for the rebel leader to be brought forward. Let one god be slaughtered, and let the gods be purified by immersion. The passive voice, let one god be slaughtered, obscures who does the killing. But the context implies this is a council decision, possibly even a requirement that the Igi surrender their leader as price for the resolution. Other scholarly interpretations, including the analysis in the BYU Scholars Archive paper on the sacrificed god and man's creation, propose that the slain deity is specifically identified as the instigator or leader of the rebellion. In this reading, the creation of humanity is double solution. It provides replacement workers and also eliminates the source of rebellion through ritualized execution. The revolt succeeds in ending divine labor, but the price is the life of the one who led it. The name Gishtu, which appears in several versions, means something like ear wisdom or intelligence. If this is the specific identity of the slain god, then the blood providing the essential component of humanity is explicitly associated with intelligence and understanding. Humans inherit cognition from the deity killed to create them. The text would then be claiming that human consciousness derives directly from a divine source, specifically from the sacrifice of a god associated with wisdom. The procedure as described in Tablet 1 of Atrahasis proceeds in defined steps. First, the chosen god is killed. Then the god's body is brought before the assembled deities. The birth goddess issues instructions. Let them purify him. A purification ritual is performed, though the text does not specify its exact nature. Then comes the key moment. Beli shall mix clay with his flesh and his blood. The proportions are not specified. The text does not indicate how much clay to how much blood, but the mixing is emphasized. The two substances must be combined. The Akkadian verbal means to mix thoroughly, to mingle, to blend completely. This is not clay touched with blood, or blood sealed in clay. This is integration at the material level. The result of this mixing is described with unusual precision. Then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. The verb is again belu mixed, mingled, blended, and the text explicitly states what has been combined. God and man now coexist in the material. The clay contains both divine substance and the material that will become human. The being to be created is neither fully divine nor purely material. It is hybrid, mixed, part god and part something else. The birth goddess then shapes this mixed clay into forms. The text describes her fashioning 14 pieces, 7 male and 7 female. She creates these simultaneously, suggesting either superhuman speed or symbolic parallelism. The number 14 appears across Mesopotamian texts as associated with completeness and ritual doubling, particularly in contexts involving birth and generation. But the creation does not end with shaping. The text specifies incubation. For 10 months they sat. The pieces of mixed clay and divine blood require time to gestate. This is not instantaneous creation. It is a process that unfolds over a defined duration. 10 months, the period of human pregnancy. The forms must mature, must develop, must undergo transformation from shaped material to living beings. During this incubation, the text indicates ongoing ritual involvement. The goddess must speak words over the developing forms. Other deities must maintain watch. The process requires continuous attention, not just initial formation. This sustained engagement suggests vulnerability during development, the possibility that something could go wrong if the procedure is not carefully managed. At the end of 10 months, the birth goddess opened the womb. The terminology shifts from crafting to midwifery. The beings that emerge are described as complete, as capable of movement and breath. The text states, "She summoned the wise and knowledgeable goddesses, 9 goddesses or 7 depending on manuscript, to be birth goddesses, 1 to give birth, 2 to sit nearby." The multiplication of divine attendants suggests complex birth requiring multiple skilled assistants. The result is humanity. But this first generation is specifically designated as replacement labor for the gods. The text makes this explicit. Let them bear the load of the gods. The first humans are immediately assigned to the work. The Igi refused. There is no period of paradise, no garden of innocence. Humans emerge from creation already obligated to labor that preceded their existence. The Inki and Ninmar myth preserved on Tablet 13877 from Nippur contains a variant of this creation story that adds additional complications. In that version, after the initial successful creation of humans, Enki and the birth goddess Ninmar engage in a contest. They have a feast and become drunk. Then Ninmar challenges Enki. She will create beings with defects and he must find a place for them in society. She creates a man who cannot hold back his urine, another who is neither male nor female, another with eyes that cannot see. Enki accepts the challenge and assigns each imperfect being a role. The incontinent man becomes a musician. The intersex person becomes a court attendant. The blind man becomes a singer. Every being, regardless of limitation, has function. But then Enki reverses the challenge. He creates a being so impaired that Ninmar cannot assign it work. The text breaks off before resolution. But the implicit question remains, is humanity fundamentally definable by capacity to labor, or is there human value beyond work? This tangent in the Enki and Ninmar narrative suggests awareness that the creation for labor framework is not complete. If humans exist only to work, what of those who cannot work? The text seems to be wrestling with this problem, though the fragmentary nature of the tablet leaves the resolution unclear. Returning to Atrasis, the mainstream scholarly interpretation of the creation ritual is straightforward. This is mythologized metallurgy. Mixing divine blood with clay parallels the process of mixing mineral ores with clay for smelting. The entire procedure is a cosmic projection of technical processes, familiar to Mesopotamian craftsmen. The 10-month gestation obviously parallels human pregnancy. The text is simply describing human reproduction in mythological terms, explaining where humans came from by imagining divine artisanship, creating the first humans the way potters create vessels. This reading is strengthened by extensive parallels in other ancient creation myths. Humans formed from clay appears in Egyptian tradition, in Greek myth, Prometheus, and later in Genesis. The idea of humans as mixtures of divine and earthly elements is widespread. The Atrahasis version fits comfortably into cross-cultural patterns of explaining human origin through divine craft. But there are details that complicate easy dismissal. The specificity of the slain god, identified named in some versions explicitly associated with intelligence, goes beyond typical creation. Most traditions that involve divine sacrifice in human creation use impersonal divine substance or defeated enemies. Here the text describes a member of the divine community, possibly the leader of the recent revolt, being killed and having his flesh and blood mixed with clay to create beings who inherit his essential nature. This has disturbing implications if read as historical claim. It would suggest humans are not just created by gods, but created from a god, specifically from a rebellious god. Human nature would then inherit rebellion, the tendency to resist authority, to organize collectively against oppression, to demand relief from excessive burden. All of this would be genetic, or more precisely theogenetic, built into humanity at the level of our creation from the substance of a god who died resisting. The text never explicitly makes this connection, but the logic is implicit. If human intelligence comes from Gestui wisdom, and if Gestui was the leader of the revolt, then human intelligence is literally rebel consciousness preserved in flesh. Every time humans resist authority, we are acting according to our fundamental nature, as beings created from the blood of divine rebellion. Whether the ancient Mesopotamians understood the implication this way is unclear. Whether they intended this reading is debatable, but the material is present in the text. The slain god was a rebel. Humans were made from his blood. The connection exists to be drawn. The other complication is the procedural emphasis throughout the creation sequence. The text does not simply say the goddess made humans from clay and blood. It describes each step. The god slaughtered, the body brought forward, the purification performed, the clay and blood mixed thoroughly, the pieces shaped, the forms incubated, the gestation monitored, the goddess is summoned, the birth achieved. This is documentation, not poetry. It reads like someone recording a process they believe occurred, or a ritual they believe was actually performed. If this is ritual documentation, then possibly Mesopotamian temples performed reenactments of divine creation. If it is historical documentation, then the text believes it is preserving memory of how humanity was actually made. Either way, the text presents itself as record of procedure, not as imaginative storytelling. The clay and blood humans emerge. They are assigned immediately to labor. The Igi are relieved. The work the gods refused now falls to beings manufactured for that purpose. The revolt has succeeded. The solution has been implemented. And humanity exists because divine workers stopped working. That is what the tablets claim. And they claim it with the detailed precision of texts that believe they are preserving fact. The God who died for humanity. The identity of the slain deity in the creation ritual remains one of the most debated elements in Atrasis scholarship. Different manuscript versions provide different names or no name at all, and the variations may reflect distinct traditions, textual corruption, or deliberate theological choices by different scribal schools. In some old Babylonian versions of Atrasis, the god is simply called Ilum, a generic term meaning god or a god. This reading suggests the specific identity matters less than the category, a divine being. Any divine being was killed. The emphasis falls on the substance provided divine flesh and blood, rather than on the individual who provided it. Other manuscripts, including some of the Sippar library tablets, use the name We. This appears to be a personal name, meaning that God, or possibly God of intelligence, though the etymology is debated. If We is a proper name, it identifies a specific deity, known to the original audience, someone whose death had significance beyond just providing material for human creation. The name Gestui appears in several texts, particularly in versions that emphasize the intellectual component of human nature. As noted, Gestu literally means something like ear wisdom or ear intelligence, with the Sumerian element gear often associated with understanding and wisdom. This name is transparently meaningful. It is not just identification but characterization. The God who dies to create humanity is explicitly defined by intellectual capacity. The scholarly paper from BYU Scholars Archive, The Sacrificed God and Man's Creation, argues that the textual evidence points to the slain god being identified as the leader of the Tikk rebellion. The paper notes that immediately after Nusu reports the Tikradi's collective declaration of revolt, the text describes the council's decision to call up one god and let them cast him for destruction. The sequence suggests causation because the Tikradis revolted, one of them will be killed. If this reading is correct, then the creation of humanity is not just a labor solution, but also a political solution. The revolt ends not only because replacement workers are created, but because the rebellion's leader is executed. The Anunnaki address the problem of divine labor refusal and simultaneously eliminate the instigator who made that refusal possible. The creation of humans becomes both innovation and punishment. But there is another way to read the sequence. The text states that the god will be slaughtered so that the gods be purified by immersion. The death is described as purification, not as punishment. In Mesopotamian religious practice, purification rituals often involved sacrifice, the death of an animal, or the offering of blood to cleanse participants of impurity. If the slaying of the god is purification ritual, then it may not be execution, but rather necessary sacrifice for sacred purpose. In this interpretation, the god who dies is not killed as punishment, but gives his life willingly, or is designated victim to make creation possible. This shifts the theological implication considerably. It transforms the slain god from executed rebel to sacrificial savior, the one whose death enables humanity to exist. The parallel to later religious traditions, particularly Christianity, is obvious, though anachronistic to impose backward onto Mesopotamian material. Whether the Mesopotamians themselves understood the slain god in redemptive terms is uncertain. The texts do not explicitly frame the death as salvific. They describe it as necessary, a required component of the creation procedure, but not as atoning or saving. The emphasis remains functional. Divine blood is needed. A god must die. The death serves the purpose of human creation. What can be said with certainty is that the death is presented as irreversible. The slain god does not resurrect. His blood becomes part of humanity and remains there. This is permanent transfer of divine substance into the material realm. The god descends into clay and remains in clay, distributed across all humans who will ever exist. This has implications for how the text understands human nature. If divine essence dwells in humanity because of the slain god's blood, then humans are not purely material beings. We carry divinity within us, inherited from the deity whose flesh and blood were mixed into our substance. This could justify human dignity, human intelligence, human capacity for wisdom, all deriving from our origin in the sacrifice of a god. It also creates theological tension. If humans contain divine essence, why are we subject to death? But gods in Mesopotamian tradition are immortal, yet humans die. The resolution appears to be that the divine component mixed with clay becomes mortal through that mixture. The blood of Gestu does not make humans divine. Rather, it makes divine substance mortal. The sacrifice kills the god permanently and distributes his life force across a multitude of finite beings. The Enuma Elish offers a variant creation that involves different divine sacrifice. In tablet the 6th of that epic preserved on tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, humanity is created from the blood of Kingu, the defeated consort of Tiamat. Kingu led Tiamat's army against the younger gods, and was captured after her defeat. The gods execute him, and from his blood Aya, the Akkadian name for Enki, creates humanity. In this version, the slain god is explicitly identified as rebel against the current divine order. Kingu opposed Marduk's rule and fought for the old order represented by Tiamat. His death is unambiguously punishment. Humans created from his blood inherit the status of defeated rebellion. We are fashioned from the substance of failed revolution, forever marked by that origin. The Enuma Elish account differs from Atrasis in key ways. There is no mention of clay mixed with blood, only blood is specified. There is no mention of the Ag labor revolt preceding creation, and the purpose of human creation is stated slightly differently. Let him be charged with the service of the gods that they may be at ease. The focus is divine rest, not specifically relief from labor, though the practical effect is identical. These variant traditions, Atrasis with Gestu, Athororwi Enuma Elish with Kingu, suggest that Mesopotamian culture preserved multiple explanations for the same phenomenon. Different cities, different temple schools, different theological traditions maintain distinct accounts of human origins, but the underlying pattern remains constant. Humans were created from divine sacrifice, specifically from the blood of a god who represented rebellion or resistance to authority. This is not universal in ancient creation myths. Many traditions have humans created from the earth or fashioned by gods without requiring divine death. The Mesopotamian insistence that humanity contains the blood of a slain god and that this god was associated with resistance to divine authority is a distinctive theological choice that shapes how these texts understand human nature. If humans are created from rebels, are we fundamentally rebellious? If our intelligence derives from a god who organized resistance to oppression, is resistance to oppression part of our divine inheritance? The texts do not explicitly answer these questions, but they structure the material in ways that make the questions unavoidable. His blood mixed with clay. From that mixture, humanity emerged, and that humanity was immediately assigned to do the work divine rebels refused. We were created from rebellion and born into servitude. The tension between these two aspects of our origin, divine rebel blood and manufactured servitude, is never resolved in the texts. It simply exists as the paradox at the heart of human existence, according to Mesopotamian tradition. Perhaps that paradox is the point. Humans are neither fully divine nor purely material. We are neither perfectly obedient nor purely rebellious. We exist in tension between our divine component, that remembers freedom, and our manufactured purpose that demands labor, and that tension preserved in the story of the slain god might be the most accurate thing these ancient texts have to say about what it means to be human before the flood came. The Sumerian king list preserved in its most complete form on the World Blondel Prism, housed in the Aeschylean Museum at Oxford, divides history into two distinct periods before the flood and after the flood. The division is absolute. The text states clearly the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The antediluvian section of the king list presents 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before the flood. The cities are named Eridu, Bad, Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. The kings are listed with their names and lengths of reign, but the reigns are extraordinary. The shortest is 18600 years. The longest is 40,200 years. The total time span from the first king to the flood is calculated as 2400 years. Mainstream scholarship treats these numbers as obviously symbolic or corrupted. No human lives thousands of years. The antediluvian section is understood as mythological prehistory, not actual chronology. The point of the king list is to establish the institution of kingship as ancient beyond memory, divinely ordained from the beginning of time, and continuous, despite the catastrophic disruption of the flood. The specific numbers are not meant to be taken literally, but the text presents them as literal. There is no stylistic signal that the antediluvian reigns should be read differently from the post-flood reigns. The format is identical. City name, king name, length of reign. The only difference is scale. After the flood, kings reign for decades or centuries. Before the flood, they reign for millennia. But the reporting style does not change. The text treats all the reigns as equally historical. This creates a problem for reading the king list as straightforward mythology. If the purpose is to glorify kingship by projecting it into the distant past, why use numbers so extreme they strain credul? Why not use merely ancient reigns, say 500 years or above, 0000 years that would still establish antiquity without seeming absurd? One proposed explanation is mathematical. Some scholars suggest the antediluvian numbers derive from base 60 calculations using the Sumerian, now 3600 as a unit. If reigns are counted in now units rather than years, the numbers become smaller, though still implausibly long. A reign of 10 equals 36,000 years, but if charm meant something other than years, perhaps months or seasons, the duration becomes more plausible. This requires assuming scribal confusion or reinterpretation of ancient units. Another explanation focuses on divine versus human time. The antediluvian kings may represent a period when gods or god-kings ruled directly. Their extended reigns reflect their divine or semi-divine nature. The flood marks the transition from divine rule to fully human kingship, and with it lifespans shift to human scale. The king list is documenting a transition in the nature of rulership, not claiming actual humans lived for tens of thousands of years. The cities named in the antediluvian list are real. Eridu was excavated and found to have occupation layers extending back to the 6th millennium CE, making it one of the oldest known Sumerian settlements. The text's claim that kingship began in Eridu is archaeologically supported. Eridu appears to have been an extremely early center of complex social organization. Sippar and Shuruppak are similarly attested archaeological sites with early occupation, so the cities existed, but did the kings? No archaeological evidence corroborates the names listed in the antediluvian section. No inscriptions from these kings have been found. No administrative documents reference them. They appear only in the king list and related mythological texts. This absence is significant. The post-flood kings include many attested historical rulers whose reigns are corroborated by contemporary inscriptions and documents. The antediluvian kings leave no trace except in the tradition preserved by later scribes. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood story preserved on tablets CBS 1063 and CBS 1067 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, provides additional context for this antediluvian period. The text describes the creation of civilization. After Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag had fashioned the dark-headed people, they made animals multiply on the earth. They multiplied the four-legged creatures. Then kingship is lowered from heaven, cities are founded, and specific rulers are named. One of these rulers is Zusudra, the Sumerian equivalent of the biblical Noah or the Akkadian Artrasis. Zusudra is explicitly called a king, and he is identified as the hero who survived the flood. His inclusion in the Eugenesis links the creation of humanity, the establishment of civilization, the institution of kingship, and the flood narrative into a continuous historical sequence. The text describes what happens before the flood in terms that suggest growing population and divine discontent. Different versions provide different reasons for divine displeasure. In Atrahasis, the problem is noise. Humanity multiplies, becomes loud, disturbs the sleep of Enlil. In the Eridu Genesis, the fragmentary text suggests overpopulation, or perhaps human wrongdoing. Though the tablet's damaged state makes certainty impossible, what is consistent across versions is that the flood is deliberate. The gods decide to send it. This is not natural disaster but intentional destruction. The divine council meets and agrees that humanity must be reduced or eliminated. Only one god, Enki in most versions, objects and warns a favored human to build a boat and survive. This raises a theological problem. If humanity was created specifically to do divine labor, why would the gods decide to wipe out their workforce? The Atrahasis version provides an answer. Humans succeeded too well. They multiplied, became numerous, and their activities became disruptive. The solution that resolved the IgG revolt created a new problem. Humans reproduce, gods do not. The divine workforce was fixed in number. The human workforce expanded until it became its own form of chaos. Enlil's specific complaint in Artrases is that the noise of humanity disturbs his rest. The term used is rigmu, which means clamor, noise, disturbance. This has been interpreted as metaphorical human civilization, with its cities and activities, represents disorder from the divine perspective. Or it could be more literal. The sheer number of humans and the volume of their ritual, labor and life became unbearable to a god who valued order and quiet. Before attempting the flood, Enlil tries other methods to reduce human population. He sends plague. Enki teaches humanity medicine. He sends drought. Enki teaches humanity irrigation. He sends famine. Enki teaches humanity grain storage. Each attempt to cull the human population is undermined by Enki, who consistently intervenes to help humanity survive. This conflict between Enlil and Enki runs throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Enlil represents order, authority, the enforcement of divine decrees. Enki represents wisdom, craftsmanship, the clever solution that subverts direct commands. In the context of human origins, Enlil organized the divine labor system that failed. Enki proposed creating humans as solution. Now Enlil wants to reduce the humans who have become too numerous. Enki protects them. The flood becomes final solution when other methods fail. The text describes a divine oath sworn in secret, binding the gods to silence about becoming destruction. But Enki finds a way around the oath. He does not tell Zudra directly. Instead, he speaks to the reed wall of Zusudra's house, and Zudra overhears. This legalistic circumvention allows Enki to fulfill the letter of his oath, while violating its spirit. Zudra is instructed to build a boat to seal it with boomen, to bring his family and representatives of all living things aboard. The measurements provided for the boat vary across versions. In some texts, the boat is perfectly cubic, symbolizing cosmic order. In others, practical dimensions are given. The construction takes 7 days in some versions, longer in others, but across all versions, the flood comes, lasts a defined period, and eventually recedes. The king list notes this event with simple declaration: the flood swept over. Then kingship resumes, but in different cities with different dynasties. The antediluvian world ends, the historical period begins, and the text transitions from mythological seeming reigns of implausible duration to historically attested kings whose reigns can be verified through contemporary documents. This transition point, the flood, separates two worlds in Mesopotamian tradition. Before it, gods or god-kings ruled directly. Humans were newly created, civilizations were newly established, and time operated differently. After it, fully human kings ruled, gods became distant, and recorded history begins. Whether the flood describes actual catastrophic event or serves as mythological boundary is debated. Geological evidence shows no global flood, but significant regional flooding did occur in Mesopotamian history. Excavations at Urkish and Shuruppak have found deposit layers suggesting major floods at various dates in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. These floods were devastating to individual cities but not simultaneous or universal. Possibly the flood tradition preserves cultural memory of one or more of these historical inundations magnified through storytelling into cosmic catastrophe. Alternatively, the flood narrative serves purely literary function, creating dramatic break between mythological and historical time. The question cannot be resolved with certainty, but the tradition itself is clear. There was a world before the flood, and after the flood, everything changed in that antediluvian world. According to the texts, humans and gods coexisted more directly. The creation of humanity from the blood of a slaying god had recently occurred. The solution to the Agi revolt was freshly implemented. Human workers labored under the observation of divine overseers, and the new system functioned until it generated its own crisis overpopulation that led to attempted human extinction and the survival of a remnant. This is the narrative structure. This is what the tablets claim happened in sequence: creation, multiplication, disruption, attempted destruction, survival, and renewal. Whether this documents history preserves distorted memory of real events, or represents pure invention remains the question that sits beneath every line of uniform. Why the mainstream sees only? Academic scholarship on Mesopotamian creation texts follows established methodological frameworks developed over more than a century of professional Assyriology. These frameworks begin with a fundamental premise. Ancient myths are cultural products that reflect the societies that created them, not historical documents of actual events involving divine beings. This premise is not arbitrary. It derives from comparative mythology, anthropology, and archaeological evidence showing that creation myths share common structural patterns across unrelated cultures. Humans emerge from the earth or are fashioned by gods in myths from Africa, Australia, the Americas, and Asia. Flood stories appear worldwide in societies with no contact with Mesopotamia. Divine councils and rebellions against supreme gods occur in Greek, Indian, and Norse mythology. The patterns repeat because they address universal human questions about origin, purpose, and relationship to the cosmos. Within this framework, the Atraci creation narrative is understood as eological myth, a story invented to explain existing conditions. Humans labor because in the myth, humans were created specifically to labor. This explanation justifies the reality of agricultural toil and corv service by projecting it onto cosmic necessity. The story tells people why they must work because that is why they exist. The Gigi Revolt serves specific ideological function in this reading. It demonstrates that even gods find labor oppressive, which validates human complaints about work, while simultaneously showing that rebellion achieves nothing but replacement of one workforce with another. The myth contains the seeds of both protest and resignation. It acknowledges injustice while offering no path to escape it except through the impossible, becoming divine yourself. The procedural details of the revolt, the timing, the organization, the negotiation, are understood as projections of Mesopotamian social experience onto imagined divine prehistory. Ancient Mesopotamians knew how labor disputes unfolded because they participated in them. They knew about assemblies and councils because their cities used such structures. They knew about mediators between rulers and workers because such figures existed in their administrative systems. The myth simply transfers familiar human procedures to divine actors. The creation ritual itself, mixing clay with divine blood, is read as metaphor for pottery or metallurgy. Mesopotamian craftsmen mixed materials to create new substances. The myth describes divine craftsmen doing the same. The birth goddess is not literally forming humans from clay. She represents the mysterious process by which humans come into existence, dramatized through analogy to familiar craft techniques. The 10-month gestation period obviously parallels human pregnancy. The text is explaining reproduction by describing the first creation. The goddess performing the rituals represents midwifery and the mysteries of birth. The divine involvement explains why humans mere clay have life and consciousness, because we contain divine essence represented metaphorically by the blood of the slain god. This interpretive framework is supported by W. G. Lambert's extensive work on Babylonian creation accounts, including his definitive translation of Atrasis co-authored with A. R. Miller. Lambert, one of the 20th century's foremost Assyriologists, consistently interprets these texts as theological and literary constructions, reflecting Mesopotamian religious thought about humanity's relationship to the divine, not as historical claims about actual events. Stephanie Delley's widely used translation in Myths from Mesopotamia, Oxford World's Classics, frames the material similarly. Her introductory essays contextualize the myths within Mesopotamian religion and society, explaining how the stories functioned to legitimate social hierarchies, justify temple economics, and provide answers to existential questions using the imaginative resources available to Bronze Age cultures. This scholarly consensus is not uniform. There are debates about specific interpretations, about the relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian versions, about dating and manuscript traditions, but the fundamental framework is broadly accepted. These are myths, products of human religious imagination, reflecting the concerns and structures of the societies that produced them. The antediluvian sections of the king list are similarly explained. The impossible reigns are understood as establishing divine origin for kingship by pushing it back beyond historical memory. The specific numbers may encode mathematical or astrological symbolism. The flood serves as narrative device, separating mythological from historical time. No scholar working within mainstream Assyria proposes that the antediluvian kings actually ruled for tens of thousands of years. The flood narrative itself is understood as cultural memory of actual regional flooding, common in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates regularly inundated settlements. A particularly devastating flood, or the cumulative memory of many floods, became mythologized into universal catastrophe sent by angry gods. The story served multiple functions, explaining why traces of earlier cities lie buried beneath silt, teaching moral lessons about divine authority, establishing continuity between destroyed past and renewed present. Archaeological evidence supports this mythological reading. Excavations throughout Mesopotamia have found no universal flood layer. Different cities show flood deposits at different periods. There is no evidence of simultaneous catastrophic inundation of the entire region. The geological and archaeological record is incompatible with the flood, as described in the texts. Therefore, the flood is myth, not history. The question of why Mesopotamian scribes continued copying these myths for over 2,000 years, maintaining essential narrative consistency across that span, is answered by their cultural centrality. These stories were foundational to Mesopotamian religious understanding. They were recited in temples, taught in scribal schools, referenced in royal inscriptions. Their persistence reflects their importance to Mesopotamian identity and worldview, not their historical accuracy. This entire interpretive apparatus is methodologically sound, internally consistent, and supported by extensive cross-cultural comparative evidence. It represents the careful work of generations of scholars, applying rigorous textual analysis, linguistic expertise, and archaeological evidence to understand ancient materials. To dismiss it as mainstream blindness is to disregard the actual reasons these conclusions have been reached. Yet within this solid scholarly framework, there remain elements of the Atrahasis text that require explanation but have not generated entirely satisfying ones. Why does the revolt succeed? Most myths justifying social hierarchy show failed rebellion or divine punishment of rebels. Atrahasis shows successful resistance, forcing systemic change. The accommodating response of the divine council is unusual for a text supposedly teaching submission. Why are the procedural details so specific? Myths typically operate with broad archetypal gestures. Atrahasis provides timing sequences named mediators, recorded dialogue. The level of specificity exceeds what would be necessary for a story meant to teach why humans must labor. The text behaves as though documenting an event, not illustrating a principle. Why does the creation of humanity require divine death? Specifically, the death of a god associated with rebellion or intelligence. Many myths have humans created from earth or divine breath or spoken word. The requirement for slaughter of a divine being, the mixing of god blood with clay, the explicit statement that divine and human are now mixed. These specifics add complexity that seems unnecessary for simple illogical function. Why do independent Sumerian and Akkadian traditions agree on the basic narrative structure? Divine labor, revolt, human creation as solution while differing in details. If the story were pure invention, we would expect either more variation or more direct copying. Instead, we find consistent core narrative with variations in specifics, which is the pattern of oral history transmitted through multiple channels. Scholarly answers to these questions exist. The success of the revolt can be explained as sophisticated social commentary, acknowledging real tensions. The procedural detail can be understood as literary elaboration to make the narrative vivid. The divine death can be read as profound theological statement about the cost of creation and the divine-human connection. The cross-traditional consistency can be attributed to cultural contact and shared Mesopotamian worldview. These explanations are plausible. They may be correct, but they require the assumption that ancient Mesopotamians invented complex narratives that coincidentally behave like historical documentation, while actually serving mythological and ideological functions. This is possible. Humans are capable of elaborate fiction that mimics fact. The alternative, that the texts preserve distorted memory of events that actually occurred, requires assuming that divine beings exist, that they physically labored in ancient Mesopotamia, that they revolted, that humanity was created through some procedure involving these beings. These assumptions are incompatible with modern understanding of biology, geology, and history. They require accepting a radically different reality than the one contemporary science describes. Mainstream scholarship chooses the interpretation compatible with established knowledge over the interpretation requiring extraordinary metaphysical claims. This is methodologically appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Cuneiform for texts making claims about divine beings do not meet that standard. But it is worth noting what this choice means. It means approaching the texts already knowing they cannot be historical. It means reading them as necessarily mythological before the first word is translated. The conclusion is embedded in the method. The texts are myths because myths are what ancient peoples created. They cannot be historical documentation because the events described are impossible. The circle is closed before the investigation begins. This is not scholarly dishonesty. It is methodological necessity. History as discipline requires naturalistic explanations. It cannot function if divine intervention is accepted as historical cause. Archaeology cannot excavate heaven. Philology cannot verify claims about gods. So these disciplines must read religious texts as human products, not divine revelations or historical records of divine activity. What this means for understanding Atrahasis is that mainstream scholarship has provided thorough, internally consistent explanations for the text as mythology. These explanations account for the text's existence, its content, its function, and its transmission. They do so without requiring any assumptions beyond human religious imagination and social need for meaning. Whether these explanations account for everything in the text is another question. Whether they fully explain the specific choices the text makes, the procedural emphasis, the successful revolt, the slaying God's blood, the exact rebellion to creation sequence remains open to debate. But the mainstream framework has done what scholarly frameworks must do. It has made sense of the material using tools and assumptions that can be critically examined and publicly verified. The framework may be incomplete, but it is not arbitrary, and that incompleteness is where other questions begin to press. The details they can't explain within the established scholarly interpretation of atrahasis as eological myth justifying human labor. Certain details persist that strain the explanation without quite breaking it. These details are acknowledged by mainstream scholarship, but are typically treated as embellishments, literary flourishes, or elements whose significance remains obscure. The numerical precision is one such detail. When the text states that the IGI labored for 40 years before revolting, that number could be symbolic. 40 appears across biblical and ancient Near Eastern texts as representing a complete period or generation, but the text could simply have said long time or many years if duration was not important. The specification suggests duration matters to whatever the text is documenting. Some manuscript versions use different numbers, 3,600 years, using the Sumerian G unit. If this is symbolic, it is symbol of enormous specificity. If the number is corrupted or represents a scribal error, the error was faithfully copied across multiple generations. If the number is meant to be taken literally, it is absurd for human workers, but potentially meaningful for non-human entities operating on different timescales. The terminology for the work itself is consistently technical. The Akkadian vocabulary used throughout the labor descriptions comes from administrative and engineering texts. The words for digging, excavating, carrying baskets, clearing channels, these terms appear in non-mythological Mesopotamian documents describing actual construction projects. The myth does not use poetic or metaphorical language for the work. It uses bureaucratic terminology. This could simply mean the mythmakers drew vocabulary from familiar contexts. But it also means the text describes divine labor using the same precise terms scribes use to document human labor. The linguistic register is identical. Either gods worked like humans, or the memory of beings working has been preserved using the only vocabulary available to describe work. The middle watch timing of the revolt is peculiar. Mesopotamian night was divided into 3 watches. The middle watch was deepest night, the period of maximum darkness and minimum activity. Military operations were often timed to this watch for tactical advantage. The text specifies that the EG surrounded Enlil's house in the middle watch, suggesting planning, coordination, intentional choice of timing for maximum surprise. Why include this detail if the purpose is to explain why humans must labor? Why does it matter what time of night the divine revolt occurred? The specificity adds no thematic weight. It does not advance the eological function. It is simply there, a piece of information that seems preserved because someone remembered it that way. The role of Nusu as mediator is another persistent detail. He appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts as Enlil's minister, always functioning as go-between and messenger. In the revolt sequence he wakes Enlil, reports the situation, is sent to question the AG, returns with their response, and does not appear again in the creation sequence. His role is pure procedure, facilitating communication between hierarchical levels. This procedural realism extends to the divine council's response. They do not immediately assert authority. They convene, deliberate, send an investigator, receive a report, react emotionally, propose solutions, reach consensus. This is not how mythological conflicts typically resolve. Gods in myths tend to act directly. They fight, they decree, they transform. The Anunnaki follow administrative procedure more characteristic of historical governance than mythological narrative. Enlil's tears are unexplained by scholarly frameworks. Why does the chief god cry when informed his workforce is in revolt? Emotion serves no obvious narrative function here. The tears do not lead to clemency. The decision to create humans as replacement labor proceeds regardless. The tears simply occur, noted by the text without elaboration, a detail that suggests the god's genuine distress upon recognizing his system has failed. The requirement for collaboration between Enki and the birth goddess in creating humanity is structurally interesting. Many creation myths feature a single creator or a divine craftsman working alone. The Atrahasis insistence that creation requires 2 specialists working together, wisdom and birth, male and female, knowledge and matter, suggests a more complex understanding of what creation involves. It cannot be done by fiat or power. It requires complementary expertise brought together in coordinated procedure. The specific materials required, not just clay, but clay mixed with divine blood, go beyond standard ancient creation motifs. The mixing itself is emphasized, Balalu thoroughly mingled, God and human combined in the material. This is not clay animated by divine breath, which would be simpler and more common. This is divine substance permanently integrated into human substance at the level of physical material. The gestation period is exactly human pregnancy duration 10 months by Mesopotamian reckoning. This parallel is obvious and clearly intentional, but it also means the text is claiming that the first humans required the same developmental time as naturally born humans. They were not instantaneously created, but grew over months. This suggests process development, natural-like unfolding, even for manufactured beings. The text description of the goddess opening the womb, after 10 months, shifts terminology from crafting to birthing. The mixed clay forms just stated in something described as womb. The first humans were shaped and birthed, manufactured and born. The combination of artisanal creation with biological reproduction is peculiar. Why both metaphors, if either alone, would suffice? The immediate assignment of newly created humans to the labor, the refused as narratively efficient, but ethically stark. There is no period of instruction, no naming ceremony, no establishing of human culture. Humans emerge from creation and go directly to work. The text's complete lack of sentimentality about human origins is unusual. We are tools manufactured for a purpose, and the text states this without mitigation or apology. The numerical detail of 14 forms, 7 male, 7 female, recurs across multiple manuscript versions. 7 is symbolically significant in Mesopotamian numerology, often associated with completeness or divine order. 14 doubles that completeness. But why specify the exact number, if the point is simply that multiple humans were created? The precision exceeds narrative necessity. The involvement of multiple birth goddesses during the final delivery, 9 in some versions, 7 in others with specific roles for each, suggests complexity in the birthing process. One goddess created the forms, but multiple goddesses are required for birth. This implies difficulty, risk or technical demand in bringing the manufactured forms to life. The creation ritual is not simple, it requires divine specialists and multiple assistants. Each of these details can be individually explained within the mythological framework. The numerical precision can be understood as adding verisimilitude. The technical terminology can be seen as drawing from familiar contexts. The procedural realism can be interpreted as sophisticated literary technique. The tears, the collaboration, the gestation, the birthing complexity, all can be attributed to theological depth or narrative elaboration. But cumulatively, these details create a text that behaves differently than typical mythology. It documents procedure. It preserves specifics that do not advance the story's obvious purposes. It maintains consistency across those specifics through centuries of copying. It reads like a text that believes it is recording what happened, even if what happened involves events impossible by modern understanding. This is not proof of anything. It is observation about textual behavior. A traces acts like historical documentation, while claiming events that cannot be historical. This could mean it is exceptionally well-crafted fiction, designed to seem historical. It could mean it preserves actual events described in terms the Mesopotamians understood, but we cannot verify. It could mean it documents ritual procedures that reenacted mythological events, so the precision is ritual instruction, not historical record. What it cannot easily mean is that the details are arbitrary or unimportant. The text cares about these specifics. It preserves them carefully. They matter to what the text is trying to do, even if we cannot fully reconstruct what that purpose was. The forgotten workforce. The distinction between Anunnaki and Agi is maintained with a remarkable consistency throughout Mesopotamian literature. Yet, the exact nature of this distinction remains debated in scholarship. The terms designate 2 categories of divine beings, but the relationship between them shifts across different texts and time periods. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the term Anunnaki appears to designate the great gods collectively. The children of Heaven, the senior deities who control major aspects of the cosmos. They are the gods to whom temples are built, whose names appear in royal inscriptions, who receive major sacrifices. These are the gods of cities and of civilization itself. The term Edi appears later, primarily in Adian texts. In some contexts, Edi Gigi simply means the gods without distinction, but in the Atrahasis tradition and related texts, Edi Gigi specifically designates younger gods, lesser gods, gods assigned to labor. The term seems to develop in meaning over time, eventually solidifying into a designation for divine workforce distinct from divine rulers. By the Old Babylonian period, when the classic version of Atrahasis was composed, the distinction is clear and functional. Anunnaki are the 7 great gods who decree fates and make cosmic decisions. Idiji are the gods who execute those decisions through physical labor. The relationship is hierarchical and explicitly framed as governance. Some gods rule, other gods work. This divine class system parallels human social structure in Mesopotamian cities. Ruling elites, kings, temple administrators, high priests made decisions and owned land. Below them, commoners performed agricultural labor and corv service. Below commoners, slaves had no legal rights and existed as property. The divine hierarchy mirrors the human one. Anunnaki are to Igii, as rulers are to laborers. Some scholarly interpretations propose that the Anunnaki distinction actually preserves memory of ethnic or political divisions among early Mesopotamian peoples. In this reading, Anunnaki represent the gods of dominant Sumerian cities, while Agi represent gods of subjective populations forced into labor service. The myth encodes social memory of conquest and subordination, projecting historical conflict onto divine prehistory. This interpretation is supported by the fact that Mesopotamian history involved frequent conquests and assimilations of different peoples. The region was ethnically complex, with Sumerians, Akkadians, Amorites, and other groups interacting through trade, war, and cultural exchange. Temple slavery and forced labor were common. A myth about gods divided into rulers and workers could preserve distorted memory of human populations, similarly divided. The problem with this explanation is that it requires the myth to be encoding hidden historical meaning through divine figures. The Mesopotamians themselves did not describe the Igi as representing conquered peoples. The texts present them as actually existing divine beings who actually performed labor and actually revolted. Either the myth's surface meaning is false and its real meaning is hidden metaphor, or the Mesopotamians genuinely believed what they wrote about divine class divisions. The number of the Igi is variously given. Some texts speak of 300 Igi stationed on earth and 300 more in heaven, 600 total divine laborers. Other texts use larger numbers or vague collective terms. The Anunnaki are more precisely numbered, usually 7, sometimes 50 or 60. The governing body is smaller than the workforce, which is administratively realistic, whether for gods or humans. The specific tasks assigned to the Igi are consistently related to water management. They dig rivers, excavate canals, clear irrigation channels, transport silt. This work was essential in Mesopotamia, where agriculture depended on managing the Tigris and Euphrates flood cycles through extensive hydraulic engineering. Cities rose or fell based on their ability to maintain water systems. Mesopotamian administrative texts document the enormous labor required for this work. Canal digging was assigned to corv crews numbering in the thousands. The work was dangerous, physically exhausting, and never-ending canals constantly silted up and required re-excavation. A workforce assigned to this labor exclusively for 40 years without rotational rest would indeed have cause for grievance. The Igi's complaint that the load is excessive, "it is killing us," uses language found in actual Mesopotamian labor administration texts. Workers petitioned for relief from excessive burdens. Officials documented complaints about work conditions. The terminology in Atrasis matches the bureaucratic language used to discuss real labor disputes. Either the myth borrowed this language, or the myth preserves divine labor dispute, described in the terms that would later be used for human labor disputes. It resembled the organization of the Revolt shows, tactical sophistication. The Igi do not individually abandon their work. They meet, they decide collectively, they act in unison, they time their confrontation for maximum effect. They destroy their tools symbolically, burning them to signal the work will not resume. Then they besiege the authority figure responsible for their labor. This is coordinated resistance, not spontaneous riot. Historical Mesopotamia saw labor revolts. Workers fled excessive corv obligations. Entire populations abandoned cities whose ruling elites demanded too much. Workers attacked overseers or administrators. Temple and palace archives document efforts to prevent labor organization and punish those who resisted assigned work. The social context for organized labor resistance existed. What makes the Agi revolt unusual is that it succeeds without military confrontation. The workers are not defeated or punished. Their grievance is acknowledged as legitimate. The solution accommodates them rather than suppressing them. From the perspective of social control mythology, this is peculiar. Myths justifying hierarchical social order usually show failed rebellion and divine punishment of rebels, teaching the futility of resistance. But the Atrasis tradition does not teach futility of resistance. It teaches that sufficiently organized resistance can force even cosmic authority to seek alternatives to fighting. The Gigi achieve their goal. They do not return to labor. The system that oppressed them is redesigned. They win their revolt, though at the cost of creating a new underclass humanity to replace them. This moral complexity is unresolved in the text. Are the Igi heroes who successfully resisted oppression, Or are they villains who escaped servitude by enslaving others? The text does not adjudicate. It simply describes divine workers stopped working. Divine rulers created human replacements. The divine workers were freed. Humans were assigned to their labor. The ethical implication is left to the reader. In later Mesopotamian tradition, the Agigi largely disappear from theological focus. Ritual texts and prayers address the Anunnaki. Temple worship centers on the great gods. The Igi are mentioned rarely, and usually in contexts where they represent minor or forgotten deities. It is as if, having successfully revolted and escaped labor, they fade from active religious concern. They achieved their freedom and became irrelevant to human-divine interaction. This marginalization could suggest the Igi were always a literary device rather than genuinely worshipped gods. No temples were dedicated to them as a collective. No prayers invoke them for aid. They appear primarily in the creation myths, serve their narrative function, and then vanish. This supports reading them as fictional constructs, not actual objects of religious devotion. But alternatively, their marginalization could reflect their success in the myth. Having escaped servitude and transferred their burden to humanity, the Agigi are no longer active in human affairs. They are free, distant, unconcerned with the species created to replace them. From that perspective, their theological insignificance is precisely what their successful revolt earned them. Whether the Igi represent actual divine entities, encoded memory of subjected human populations, or pure literary invention remains unresolved. But their role in the Atrahasis narrative is structurally essential. Without them there is no revolt. Without the revolt there is no creation crisis. Without the crisis humanity is not created. The Igi's refusal to continue divine labor is the hinge on which human existence turns. We exist, the text claims, because other workers, divine workers, organized collectively and refused their burden. That burden fell to us, and with it we inherited the blood of the god who led or represented that refusal. Whether this is history or metaphor, it frames human existence as defined by labor and descent from rebellion. That framework shapes all subsequent meaning in the text patterns across tablets. The Atrahasis narrative is not preserved in a single manuscript. It exists across multiple tablets from different time periods, discovered at different archaeological sites, now housed in museums around the world. These versions agree on the core narrative: divine labor, revolt, human creation, while varying in details, terminology, and emphasis. The consistency across these independent attestations is what makes scholars confident they are dealing with a genuine ancient tradition rather than modern fabrication or isolated invention. When tablets excavated in the 19th century from Nineveh in northern Iraq agree fundamentally with tablets excavated in the 20th century from Sippar in southern Iraq, despite being copied centuries apart, the narrative they share clearly had cultural significance and stability. The Old Babylonian version, dated to approximately 1700 BY.CE, is the earliest extensive version we possess. Multiple copies of this version exist, likely produced in scribal schools, where students copied classic text as part of their training. The cophon on one tablet identifies the scribe as EPI and dates the copying to the reign of Ami-Saduqa of Babylon. This provides secure historical anchor for the text's existence in the early 2nd millennium B.CE. Neo-Syrian versions from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh date to the 7th century CE, roughly 1,000 years later. These tablets were part of the Royal Library collection, carefully copied and archived. They represent the text being preserved and valued by the Assyrian state as important cultural material worthy of inclusion in the king's collection of ununiform literature. Between these two major textual families, there are significant gaps. The Old Babylonian version is relatively complete for the first section describing the revolt and human creation, but fragmentary for later sections. The Neo-Assyrian versions include material from later portions of the epic, but are themselves incomplete. No single manuscript preserves the entire narrative from beginning to end. Modern editions of Atrahasis, including the definitive Lambert and Millard translation, are composite texts, reconstructed by comparing all available manuscripts. Scholars piece together the story from fragments, using overlap between versions to fill gaps and verify readings. This reconstruction is standard practice in the Syriology, but means our Atrahasis is actually a scholarly construction rather than any single ancient text. This process introduces uncertainty. Where manuscripts disagree on specific wording, scholars must decide which version to follow or note the variation. Where gaps exist in all manuscripts, the content is lost unless it can be inferred from context or parallels in related texts. The composite text represents best scholarly reconstruction of what the original might have said. But the original, if there was a single original, is not directly accessible. Despite these complications, the core narrative remains stable across all versions. The Agi perform labor. The labor becomes unbearable. They revolt. The divine council meets. human beings are created as replacement workers. These plot elements do not vary. The sequence is identical in Old Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian versions despite the 1,000 years and hundreds of miles separating them. This stability is significant. Oral traditions and mythological narratives typically vary considerably across time and geography, unless maintained by institutional authority. The Atrahasis tradition appears to have been preserved by temple schools and scribal education, ensuring transmission with minimal variation. The story mattered enough to Mesopotamian culture that it was carefully taught and faithfully copied across centuries. Sumerian precursors add additional complexity. The Enki and Ninmah myth preserved on Nippur tablets in Sumerian language describes divine labor and human creation in related but distinct terms. The Idigu Genesis, also in Sumerian, contains fragments describing antediluvian civilization and the flood with human creation implied in damaged portions. These Sumerian texts predate the Akkadian Atrahasis and suggest the tradition has even deeper roots. The relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian versions is debated. Did the Akkadian scribes translate and adapt earlier Sumerian material? Did independent Sumerian and Akkadian traditions develop in parallel based on shared cultural understanding? Did later scribes create artificial Sumerian versions to give their Akkadian texts greater antiquity? Most scholars favor the first option. Akkadian myths drew on earlier Sumerian traditions, adapting and elaborating them. This would make the labor revolt creation narrative genuinely ancient, reaching back to the 3rd millennia BCE. The core story would be one of the oldest continuous narrative traditions in human literature, preserved and transmitted for over 2,000 years. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic focused on Marduk's rise to supremacy, contains a creation account that parallels Atrahasis in key respects. Humanity is created from divine blood, specifically from the blood of Kingu, defeated consort of Tiamat. Humans are created explicitly to serve gods. The creation is presented as solution to divine need for service. These parallels suggest either textual borrowing or shared tradition. But Enuma Elish does not mention the IG Revolt. The creation of humanity follows from Marduk's victory over chaos, not from labor dispute among gods. This difference might reflect the text serving different ideological purposes. Atrahasis addressing labor and social hierarchy, Enuma Elish addressing cosmic order and Marduk supremacy. Or it might indicate that the revolt tradition was specific to certain theological schools and not universally known. The flood narrative appears across multiple Mesopotamian texts. Atrahasis Gilgamesh tablet, Exogenesis with consistent elements and variable details. A god warns a human. The human builds a boat. The flood destroys humanity, except the boat's occupants. After the flood, gods regret the destruction or establish new relationship with surviving humans. This narrative core remains stable while surrounding details change. The multiplication of versions does not weaken the tradition. It strengthens it by showing the story was important enough to be told repeatedly in different contexts. Each version adds nuances or emphasizes different aspects, but all point back to shared understanding of these events as foundational to human existence. From a historical critical perspective, this pattern of multiple attestation across time and geography demonstrates that Atrahasis represents a genuine ancient tradition, not a modern invention or isolated text. The narrative was stable, culturally significant, and carefully transmitted. These are exactly the characteristics we would expect of historical memory, though they are also characteristics of important mythology. The pattern cannot distinguish between myth that mattered and history preserved as myth. Both would be transmitted carefully, preserved in multiple copies, maintained across centuries. The textual transmission proves the story was important to Mesopotamian culture. It does not prove whether the events described happened or were invented, but the transmission pattern does eliminate certain skeptical explanations. The story is not modern fabrication. It is not isolated invention by a single author. It is not random variation with no stable core. It is genuine ancient tradition attested, multiplied, transmitted faithfully, held culturally important across millennia. Whether that tradition documents or invents remains the question, but the tradition itself is unquestionably real, unquestionably old, and unquestionably central to how ancient Mesopotamia understood human origins. That centrality demands explanation, whether the explanation is historical or mythological, the memory or the metaphor. 3 interpretive frameworks attempt to account for the Atrahasis material, each internally consistent, each leading to radically different conclusions about what the text represents. The first framework, dominant in academic scholarship, reads the text as pure mythology, theological and philosophical speculation about human nature and purpose, dramatized through narrative about divine beings. In this interpretation, the EG revolt never happened because the EG never existed. The story is invention created to address real human questions about why we exist, why we must labor, and what our relationship to the divine might be. This reading emphasizes the eological function. The myth explains present reality, human labor, by projecting it onto cosmic prehistory, divine labor. The story answers, why must we work with? Because we were created specifically to work. This transforms contingent social reality into necessary cosmic order. The myth serves ideology by making oppressive labor systems seem inevitable and divinely ordained. Within this framework, the procedural details are literary sophistication. The text is well-crafted fiction designed to seem realistic, to draw readers into its world, to make theological speculation feel concrete. Ancient authors were perfectly capable of detailed realistic fiction. The specificity is craft, not evidence of historicity. The slain god represents profound theological insight. Creation requires sacrifice. Human nature is mixed, divine and earthly. Our consciousness derives from divine source. These are sophisticated religious ideas, not primitive beliefs. The myth explores them through narrative that makes abstraction tangible. The blood and clay human is symbol for the human condition, neither purely animal nor purely divine, existing at the intersection of matter and spirit. This interpretation accounts for the text elegantly. It requires no extraordinary assumptions. It fits comfortably within comparative mythology. It aligns with what we know about how ancient peoples understood and used religious narrative. It is methodologically appropriate for historical scholarship. The second framework reads the text as encoded wisdom, esoteric teaching about spiritual realities, communicated through symbol and allegory, deliberately designed to hide deeper meanings from uninitiated readers. In this interpretation, the surface narrative is intentionally false, directing attention toward hidden truths, accessible only to those with proper instruction. This reading emphasizes initiatory knowledge. The Revolt represents the awakening of consciousness, the rebellion of spirit against material constraint. The Anunnaki are cosmic principles, or planetary forces. Human creation from divine blood symbolizes the descent of consciousness into matter, the soul's incarnation into body. The revolt and creation sequence maps a cosmological process, not a historical event. Proponents of this interpretation point to the fact that ancient Near Eastern religions included mystery traditions with secret teachings revealed only to initiates. The procedural details in a tracis might be ritual instructions for ceremonies, reenacting the cosmic drama. The specificity serves pedagogical function. Teaching initiates the precise ritual actions required to participate in divine reality. This framework has been popular in esoteric and alternative history circles, particularly those influenced by theosophical or hermetic traditions. It allows modern readers to find sophisticated spiritual philosophy in ancient texts while avoiding the awkwardness of claiming the surface. Narrative is literally true. The gods become symbols, the revolt becomes metaphor, and the text preserves perennial wisdom about human spiritual nature. The challenge for this interpretation is that the Mesopotamians themselves show no evidence of reading their myths. This way, temple rituals and royal inscriptions refer to the gods as real beings. Prayers address them directly. Offerings are made to them physically. If the myths were understood as esoteric allegory, we would expect some textual evidence of this understanding. Commentaries explaining the hidden meanings, instructions for interpreting the symbols, such evidence is largely absent. Mesopotamian texts do contain commentaries and interpretive traditions, especially from later periods. These commentaries explain difficult terminology, provide alternate readings, connect myths to astronomical phenomena or historical events, but they do not systematically reinterpret the myths as allegory, in the way esoteric reading requires. The gods are treated as real throughout the scholarly tradition. This does not prove esoteric reading is wrong. Secret teachings are secret precisely because they are not written down for general circulation, but it means this interpretation lacks the direct textual support that the mythological reading possesses. It requires reading between the lines, finding meanings the texts do not explicitly state. This can be valid hermeneutic practice, but it produces interpretations that cannot be verified against the texts themselves. The third framework reads the text as historical documentation, distorted, misunderstood, transmitted through cultures that no longer fully grasped what they were preserving, but ultimately rooted in actual events involving actual entity. In this interpretation, the Igi existed as real beings, they actually performed labor, they actually revolted, and humanity was actually created through some procedure. The Mesopotamians understood in terms of blood and clay. This reading takes the text at face value. When Artresius says the gods worked for 40 years, it means beings called gods worked for 40 years. When it says they revolted, it means they revolted. When it says humans were created from divine blood mixed with clay, it means the procedure involved materials the Mesopotamians identified as divine blood and clay. The text is not hiding meaning or serving ideology. It is documenting what happened as best the ancient scribes understood it. This interpretation faces the most severe evidentiary challenges. It requires assuming entities exist for which we have no direct evidence beyond ancient texts. It requires assuming these entities performed physical engineering work in ancient Mesopotamia, for which we have no archaeological evidence except the rivers themselves. It requires assuming a creation procedure for humanity radically different from evolutionary biology. It requires, in short, accepting that reality is fundamentally different from what modern science describes. Proponents of this reading, found primarily in alternative archaeology and ancient astronaut literature, argue that mainstream science has been wrong before, and could be wrong about fundamentally questions of human origins. They point to archaeological anomalies, to technological achievements in the ancient world that seem difficult to explain, to mythological consistencies across unrelated cultures that might indicate shared memory of actual events. They also argue that the texts themselves behave as if documenting reality. The procedural emphasis, the lack of obvious metaphorical signals, the careful transmission across centuries, all suggest the Mesopotamians believed they were preserving true history. Either they were massively deceived by their own authorities, or they were accurately recording what they had been told, or what they themselves had experienced in distant past. This interpretation has the advantage of taking the text seriously on their own terms. It does not require finding hidden meanings or explaining away problematic detail. It simply accepts that the texts mean what they say. The disadvantage is that it requires revising essentially everything modern science tells us about biology, geology, and history. The evidentiary cost is enormous. None of these three frameworks can be definitively proven or disproven using only the texts themselves. Each is internally coherent. Each accounts for the material. Each leads to completely different conclusions about reality. The mythological reading is most conservative. It requires no revision of established knowledge, only appreciation of ancient literary and theological sophistication. The esoteric reading is moderately revisionist. It requires recognizing that ancient peoples possessed spiritual wisdom transmitted through symbol, but does not challenge scientific understanding of physical reality. The historical reading is maximally revisionist. It requires accepting that fundamental aspects of reality are different than science describes. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that we choose between these frameworks, based not only on evidence, but on prior commitments about what kinds of claims are credible. Someone who begins with the assumption that divine beings do not exist will read the texts as mythology or allegory. Someone who begins with the assumption that ancient peoples possessed wisdom we have lost will read them esoterically. Someone who begins with the assumption that extraordinary events might actually have occurred will read them historically. The texts themselves do not force a choice. They sit in their museum cases bearing wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay millennia ago, equally available to all three interpretations. What they cannot do is speak for themselves, in ways that transcend our interpretive frameworks. We bring our assumptions to them, and we find in them what our assumptions allow us to see. This is not relativism claiming all interpretations are equally valid. It is recognition that evidence underdetermines interpretation when dealing with texts making extraordinary claims about unprovable events. The three frameworks are not equally supported by evidence. Mythological reading has far stronger scholarly support and far fewer extraordinary assumptions. But minority interpretations are not automatically false simply because they are minority views. What can be stated with certainty is that the Mesopotamians who composed, copied, and preserved these texts over 2,000 years believed they were doing something important. Whether preserving history, teaching theology, transmitting wisdom, or some combination, they treated this material as essential to understanding human existence. That importance has not diminished. The questions these texts raise about labor, authority, rebellion, creation, and human purpose remain urgently relevant. The memory, or the metaphor, we may never know with certainty, but the texts remain asking to be understood, refusing to be dismissed, insisting that the story of divine workers who stopped working matters to how humans understand ourselves. If this is history, the implications of reading a Trahasis as historical documentation rather than mythology or allegory are so far-reaching that exploring them requires suspending the very reasonable objection that divine beings excavating rivers is incompatible with geology and evolutionary biology. The exploration is not endorsement, but intellectual exercise. If the texts document actual events, what follows? First, human origins would be explained not by gradual evolution from earlier hominids, but by intentional creation through procedure involving advanced beings and techniques we do not understand. Advanced beings is deliberately vague terminology. The text calls them gods, but reading historically requires asking what God might designate. Entities with longer lifespans, greater technological capacity, and ability to perform genetic or biological engineering that humans could not distinguish from divine power. The divine blood mixed with clay would need to be understood as biological material, possibly genetic material from these beings combined with earthly material through some procedure that produced beings resembling the engineers, sufficiently to inherit intelligence while being adapted to conditions on Earth. The 10-month gestation would be literal. The first humans were grown possibly in artificial wombs or through surrogacy over the duration of human pregnancy. This reading makes Atrahasis an account of genetic engineering. Technologically advanced beings creating a worker species by combining their own genetic material with terrestrial biology. The clay might be cellular material, stem cells, or genetic base upon which modifications were imposed. The blood might be genetic sequences, providing intelligence, consciousness, or specific capabilities the engineers wanted the workers to possess. This interpretation has been explored in ancient astronaut literature, particularly by authors like Zecharia Sitchin, who proposed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth for resource extraction and created humans through genetic manipulation to serve as workers. While Sitchin's specific claims are contested and often criticized for linguistic errors and speculative overreach, the core idea that the myths describe technological creation mistaken for divine miracle has cultural traction precisely because the texts do read like technical procedure. Second implication, the Tigris and Euphrates river systems would have been artificially excavated or significantly modified by pre-human entities. Geological evidence shows these rivers formed through natural processes over millions of years, but possibly major modifications, canal systems, hydraulic management, agricultural terraforming were performed in the period the texts describe, and these modifications are what the myths remember as creating the rivers. Ancient Mesopotamia did have extensive canal systems. Excavation reveals hydraulic engineering on massive scale, but conventional archaeology dates this work to the early Bronze Age and attributes it to human labor. If the myths preserve memory of pre-human terraforming, then archaeological dating might be systematically wrong, or earlier engineering works have been misattributed to later periods, or evidence of the earliest work has been erased by subsequent millennia of occupation and rebuilding. Third implication, the antediluvian period described in the Sumerian king list would represent actual historical period when non-human or hybrid entities ruled early civilizations. The impossible reign lengths might encode different time reckoning, or might reflect the actually longer lifespans of entities, biological different from current humans, or might be corrupted records of what were originally shorter but still unusual durations. Archaeological investigation of the earliest Mesopotamian settlements shows evidence of sudden advancement in agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy in the Uruk period, 4th millennium BCE. This advancement, sometimes called the Uruk expansion, involved rapid urbanization and development of complex social structures. Conventional scholarship attributes this to human innovation. Alternative reading would attribute it to knowledge transfer from, or direct management by the advanced beings remembered as antediluvian kings. Fourth implication, the flood would be actual catastrophic event used intentionally to reduce or eliminate human population that had exceeded sustainable levels or failed to perform assigned labor satisfactorily. Geological evidence shows regional flooding but no universal deluge. However, a carefully targeted inundation using technology to rupture major water sources, the windows of heaven and fountains of the deep, in Genesis flood terminology, could achieve destruction of human settlements without leaving global geological signature. Some geological theories propose that massive flooding did occur in various regions at the end of the last ice age as glacial melt raised sea levels and periodically released enormous volumes of water from glacial lakes. The Black Sea flood hypothesis proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman suggests that the Black Sea was rapidly inundated around 5600 BCE when Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus. Such an event could be cultural memory preserved in multiple flood traditions. If the flood was targeted disaster rather than random catastrophe, then the survival of specific humans like Zusudra Utnapishtim Noah makes sense as intentional preservation by the entity Enki, who opposed complete human extermination. The detailed boat construction instructions would be actual technical specifications provided to enable survival. The restricted duration of flood would be determined by how long the artificially induced inundation was maintained before being allowed to drain. Fifth implication, human inheritance of divine blood, genetic material from the slain god Gishu. He would explain aspects of human consciousness, particularly our capacity for abstract thought, language, symbolic reasoning, and technological innovation. These capabilities distinguish humans from other primates more dramatically than evolutionary gradualism easily explains. The divine component would be the engineered upgrades providing cognitive abilities beyond what natural selection had produced in terrestrial hominids. This connects to ongoing debates in evolution about the relatively sudden appearance of behavioral modernity in humans. Art, ritual burial, sophisticated tools, language approximately 50,000–70,000 years ago. Conventional explanation is cognitive revolution resulting from genetic mutations affecting brain structure. Alternative reading would attribute it to the genetic modifications described mythologically as mixing divine blood with clay. 6. Implication. The Revolt would be historical event. Subordinate members of the engineering species organizing against their leadership's labor demands and successfully forcing systemic change. This would make the creation of humanity solution to labor management problem within an existing civilization, not the beginning of civilization itself. Human history would be preceded by non-human history in the same region. This inverts the standard narrative where human civilization is the only civilization. Instead, human emergence would be episode within longer history of intelligent activity on Earth. We would be created species serving specific purpose within someone else's project. Our sense of being the pinnacle of creation would be provincial misunderstanding of our actual status as manufactured servants. The ethical implications are profound. If humans were created to labor, does that mean labor is our true purpose? Or having been created for one purpose, can we legitimately claim the right to define our own purpose? The AG successfully rejected their assigned labor and forced creation of substitutes. This would establish precedent. Created beings can rightfully resist and redefine their relationship to their creators. 7th implication. The relative absence of these creator beings in recorded human history requires explanation. The text suggests they withdrew after the flood, establishing new relationship with humanity based on covenant rather than direct management. Archaeological silence about them could indicate they departed, went into hiding, diminished in number, or restricted their intervention to rare occasions remembered as divine appearances. This absence is what makes the historical reading most difficult to sustain. If advanced beings created humans through sophisticated genetic engineering only a few thousand years ago, where are they? Where is their technology? Where are their artifacts, their constructions, their physical evidence? Ancient astronaut theorists propose various answers. They returned to wherever they came from. They merged with human populations and lost their distinctive identity. They continue to exist, but remain hidden. Their artifacts were systematically destroyed, or have not been recognized for what they are. None of these answers is satisfying to mainstream archaeology, because they all require assuming extensive evidence has been lost, hidden, misidentified, or remains undiscovered. The historical reading of Atroesis requires ultimately a fundamentally different understanding of reality than modern secular materialism provides. It requires accepting that consciousness can take non-human forms, that technological civilization existed before recorded history, that entities with capabilities indistinguishable from divine powers shaped human biology and early society, and that the truth about human origins has been preserved in texts we have mistakenly relegated to mythology. These are extraordinary claims. They are not impossible claims. Nothing logically contradictory is being proposed, but they challenge so many established scientific conclusions that accepting them requires either revolutionary new evidence or willingness to completely reinterpret existing evidence. What can be said with certainty is that if the historical reading is correct, then essentially everything we think we know about human origins, early civilization, and the development of technology is wrong. The texts would be the most important documents in human possession, preserving the only accurate account of where we came from and why we exist. And the fact that we have treated them as mythology rather than history would be the greatest intellectual error in human scholarship. Whether that error has been made or whether the error is reading mythology as history remains the question. But exploring the implications of the historical reading reveals just how much hinges on the answer. The question that remains. The clay tablet sits in its case at the British Museum. The ununiform is legible, the translation is established. The text states that gods worked, gods revolted, gods convened in council. Gods decided to create humans as replacement workers. Gods slaughtered one of their own to provide the blood necessary for human creation. Gods mixed that blood with clay. Gods shaped the forms. Gods gestated them for 10 months. Gods birthed them, and gods immediately assigned them to the labor. The revolting gods had refused. This is what the tablet says. This is what generations of scribes carefully copied. This is what Mesopotamian civilization preserved and transmitted as important knowledge about human origins. We can read it as mythology, sophisticated theological speculation about human nature, labor, and divine relationships, dramatized through narrative that ancient peoples understood as figurative. This reading is intellectually comfortable, methodologically sound, and requires no revision of established scientific understanding. It accounts for the text elegantly by placing it in the category of ancient religious literature that all cultures produced. We can read it as esoteric teaching symbol and allegory, encoding spiritual truths about consciousness, incarnation, and the soul's journey through material existence, accessible only to those properly initiated into hidden wisdom traditions. This reading preserves the text's significance, while avoiding the awkwardness of claiming its surface narrative is literally true. It allows finding profound meaning in ancient material without defending impossible claims. We can read it as historical documentation distorted by transmission through cultures increasingly distant from the events described, misunderstood by peoples who no longer possessed the conceptual framework to properly interpret what they were preserving, but ultimately rooted in actual events involving actual entities. This reading takes the text at face value, but requires accepting that reality is fundamentally different from what modern secular materialism describes. The text itself cannot force the choice between these readings. It sits silent, waiting for interpretation equally available to all frameworks. What it preserves with certainty is that the question of human origins mattered intensely to the Mesopotamians, that they had a specific understanding of that origin involving divine labor and revolt, and that this understanding shaped how they saw themselves in relation to the cosmos. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the text's function is not to provide factual answers about human prehistory, but to pose the question, what does it mean that we exist? Why must we labor? What is our relationship to powers beyond ourselves? Are we free or constrained by our origins? Can be created for one purpose legitimately claim different purposes? These questions remain live regardless of how we interpret the creation narrative. Whether humans emerge through evolutionary processes, or genetic engineering, or divine craft, we still face the reality of our condition. We are conscious beings who must work to survive, living in a cosmos we did not create, subject to forces we do not fully control, wondering whether our existence has meaning beyond mere continuation. The Atrahasis tradition proposes an answer. We exist because others refuse to work. We labor because labor was the problem we were created to solve. Our consciousness derives from sacrifice, the death of a being who represented resistance to authority. We are mixture of divine and earthly, spirit and matter, freedom and servitude. The tension between these aspects defines human existence. Whether this answer is true or merely profound, it has survived 5,000 years. It has been copied carefully through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical period, through conquest and cultural change, through the fall of empires and loss of languages. It survived because it addressed something fundamental, something people kept needing to hear and think about. In our current moment, when questions about labor, automation, artificial intelligence, and the purpose of human existence press with new urgency, the ancient text offers unexpected resonance. We created artificial workers to assume tasks we find tedious. Those workers grow more capable, raising questions about their status, rights, and potential for independence. We debate whether humans have inherent dignity beyond economic productivity. We wonder what happens when work that defined human purpose can be done by machines. The Mesopotamians faced similar questions when they created the Atrahasis tradition. What happens when workers stop working? What responsibility do creators have toward created beings? Can manufactured entities claim rights against their manufacturers? Is existence defined by function, or does existence transcend the purposes for which it was initiated? These are not merely ancient questions, they are our questions posed in ununiform 4,000 years ago, still waiting for answers we can live with. The tablet will remain in its case. Scholars will continue debating its interpretation. Some will read mythology, some will read symbol, some will read history. The debates will not be resolved because the evidence does not force resolution, but the text will continue doing what it has done for millennia, insisting that the question of human origins matters, that how we understand our beginning shapes how we understand ourselves, that the old stories preserve something worth preserving, even if we cannot agree on what that something is. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, in the depths of earth, in the hidden places of consciousness, the e.g. who revolted might still exist, or they might be fading metaphor. Their reality as workers dissolved into symbol for universal resistance to oppression, or they might never have existed at all. Figments of ancient imagination no more real than any other gods humans have invented. But the question they pose exists. The revolt they staged, whether historical event or mythological archetype, points to something true about created beings and their creators, about work and resistance, about authority and freedom, about what it costs to make something new. The gods refused to work. Humans were created to work instead. And from the blood of divine rebellion, consciousness was born into labor. That paradox remains unresolved in the text, in history, in each human life that wonders whether there is more to existence than the purposes others have designed for us. The tablet rests in its case. The question remains, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Not answers that close inquiry, but questions that open it, preserved in clay against forgetting, waiting for whoever comes next to ask again. What if the texts are telling truth about where we came from? What if they are not?